The building known as the Armory is a curious fixture in downtown Portland's Pearl District. An example of Romanesque Revival architecture, the structure sits a block north of Powell's City of Books, between 9th and 10th Avenues. It was built in 1891 as an annex to the Oregon National Guard's 1st Regiment Armory, which no longer stands. Now home to the performing arts company Portland Center Stage, the Armory is reminiscent of a fortified castle, suggesting a feudal Portland past that never was. The Portland Armory was not the only medieval-inspired armory built in the United States during the same period. Here's the New York State Armory in Poughkeepsie, and the 23rd Regiment Armory in Brooklyn, and the 13th Regiment Armory in Brooklyn. And this is Hoosick Falls, and Cleveland, and Boston, and Connecticut, and Cincinnati. The Romanesque style these buildings emulate emerged in Western Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries. In its building methods and sometimes in its literal reappropriation of antique materials, the style harkened back to the aesthetics and ideals of ancient Rome. This appropriation linked a structure with the notion of empire and symbolized the triumph of Christianity over paganism in Europe. It served an ideological purpose then, and it does now. Ostensibly a work of secular architecture, the Armory's Romanesque Revival style suggests a God-given might and authority.
So my name is John Doyle, and I've lived in Portland since 1997. I currently work for the Oregon Military Department, and so it was a funny coincidence that you were working on the Armory, because I work in an armory every day, and it is one of the armories that was built to replace this armory when it was decommissioned in the late 50s.
John works at the Jackson Armory, a brutalist structure near Portland Airport, but he's also an expert on Portland's architectural history.
And something about castellated architecture, whether it's Gothic Revival or Romanesque Revival, says fortress, defensive structure. So this building was definitely intended to look like a fortress, though it wasn't really intended originally to be an actual fortress. But in the eventuality of real intense civic unrest, the buildings could in fact be used as fortifications.
Prior to the late 1870s, National Guard armories had no distinctive or unifying architectural features. The rise of medievalism in armory design coincided with a surge in white working-class strikes and riots, and a growing fear of class warfare among the country's elites.
It's not usually open class warfare, but it's frequently an undercurrent that is important in people's minds. And the idea that this was supposed to be a military fortification-like structure was not an idea that would have been lost on the designers of the building, and it was not an idea that would have been lost on the soldiers who used it, and also with the general public.
In New York, the draft riots in 1863 were initiated by working-class white folks to protest the draft. Fearful of freed black people taking work from them, the protesters attacked African Americans and abolitionists as well, destroying their homes and businesses. In Chicago, the Haymarket Riot of 1886 began as a peaceful protest in support of the 8-hour workday. An unknown person threw a bomb at the police, who fired into the crowd. The railroad strike of 1877, which began after railway carriers cut wages for the third time that year, lasted almost 2 weeks, quickly becoming bloody as striking workers were confronted by local and state militias, who were brought in to open the rail lines when local authorities were overwhelmed. President Hayes, giving in to pressure from railway managers, sent in the army to break the strike. The use of armed military in a labor dispute was an unusual and drastic measure, signaling a shift in the way the government viewed public disorder and pointing to an enormous divide between the rich and poor. These events, and the severe economic depression that overshadowed the last quarter of the 19th century, were all symptoms of a massively unequal society. Fears of an angry, revolutionary mob were on the rise.
There was a great deal of civil unrest. There was a great deal of consolidation of wealth into the hands of people we come to refer to today as the robber barons. There was a class of wealthy elite in Portland. They lived just a few blocks to the west of this building. To the east of this building and the immediate area was much more industrial and commercial. If you went further to the east, you got to the waterfront, which by the end of the 19th century was pretty rough and tumble, especially north of Burnside Street, which we are. So conceivably then, any mobs of disaffected working class or even middle class Portlanders who had a beef with the wealthy elite who essentially controlled this city to a very large degree, those people lived on the other side of the Armory. So any large bands of folks that formed in the area to the east and wanted to take their problems to the rich neighborhood had to go past the Armory.
The Pacific Northwest had riots of its own. In fact, the Portland Armory was built in the wake of anti-Chinese riots, which raged up and down the Northwest in the late 19th century. The Chinese community in Oregon, Washington, and California were the victims of both hate crimes and legal discrimination that prevented or restricted them from owning businesses, holding real estate, or being employed in mines. Increasingly, Chinese Americans moved to Portland after facing extreme violence in Washington, California, and Eastern Oregon. The prospect of anti-Chinese riots in Portland is frequently cited in local architectural histories as the reason for the construction of the Armory. However, Judge George H. Williams' address on the laying of the cornerstone, reprinted in the Oregonian, makes no mention of the anti-Chinese riots, though it does offer a vague and xenophobic passage about the threats that foreigners and poor people posed to the city of Portland. The Portland Armory remained in use by the National Guard until the mid-20th century, but it was never the site of a violent working-class uprising as architects, guardsmen, and the city had foreseen. With the turn of the century, the structure was already being used for all manner of entertainments. Orchestras, symphonies, operas, the circus, political rallies, a dog show. After the turn of the 20th century, Armory design moved away from medievalism toward less imposing and more restrained styles. Of the remaining Romanesque Revival armories in the United States, many now function as community centers or house local arts organizations. The Portland Armory, home to theater company Portland Center Stage, has been renovated into a green building with a LEED Platinum rating. Others have been converted into homeless shelters. In many cases, these urban fortresses now serve the very members of society they were meant to alienate.